The first real national labor union, which was short-lived when all was said and done, was the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor followed a Masonic ritual, first of all, and used that type of structure with secret handshakes and so forth and so on. And part of it was to keep their doings secret from the employer. Well, in the 1880s, Terence Powderly became the Grand Master Workman, and he was also mayor of Scranton, and a Catholic. And it got tied up then with some popular socialistic theories, especially of a man in New York named Henry George. He ran for mayor of New York in 1886 with the support of Terence Powderly and the Knights of Labor. In the fall of 1886, while this controversy was brewing in New York, the archbishops of the country, who had the right to pass on the toleration of these secret societies, voted on the Knights of Labor, but two archbishops voted for a condemnation, that this was a condemned secret society. It was the Archbishop of Santa Fe and the Archbishop of St. Louis. In both of those cities, there had been railroad strikes, violent ones. Nevertheless, Archbishop Gibbons of Baltimore, who had just been named a cardinal, went to Rome and he defended the Knights of Labor. He argued, among other things, that this, after all, was a movement of labor people against unbridled capitalism. In the fall of 1887, Rome approved the Knights of Labor, provided that they changed their constitutions to remove any issue of these secret societies. Was they took an oath never to reveal their activities to any authority in church or state. You had these clauses in their constitution. Terence Powderly changed them to conform with church teaching. So Catholic membership was then permitted. As a result of Cardinal Gibbons's defense of the Knights of Labor and his asking the Holy See, the Pope, not to condemn the writings of Henry George, but to write an encyclical on the mutual rights of capital and labor. In 1891, Pope Leo XIII issued his first social encyclical, the first Catholic social encyclical, Rerum Novarum. John Ryan, who would become prominent at the Catholic University of America later on, was a student at the St. Paul Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. In 1893, when he said he never had heard the encyclical taught in a course, but he read it on his own, and this revolutionized his life.
So he did a doctoral dissertation trying to translate Pope Leo XIII's teaching that all workers had a right and justice to a living wage into concrete goals and means in the United States. How much would a living wage be in 1906 when he published it? He came up with some dollar figures, north and south. And how would you get it? And he examined, well, could you get it through union organization? Unions were pretty weak. Could you get it through exhortation and urging employers to do it? Well, no, because if the good employer paid the living wage and the bad employer didn't, the good employer would be put out of business. So he concluded that you could only get a living wage through legislation, minimum wage laws. And when his book on that subject was published, he became a kind of national authority on minimum wage laws and the Catholic priest who was engaged in the progressive movement. So by 1910, every progressive organization he seems to have joined, and they'd have him as the Catholic on their masthead and letterhead. In 1919, when the bishops decided to organize nationally to have a presence in Washington and on the national scene, Ryan was made the head of their social action department and authored a document the bishops published, which was a program of social reconstruction pointing towards desirable social reforms after World War I. It was kind of a blueprint for the later New Deal. Minimum wage laws, support for the right of labor to organize, social welfare legislation of the Social Security type, insurance against accident, sickness, unemployment, and old age, that kind of thing that comes later in the New Deal. So he had written that for the bishops. And then from then until his death in 1945, he was kind of the bishop's advisor. He was a very strong supporter of Franklin Roosevelt, to the degree that Father Coughlin, who had initially supported Roosevelt and then opposed him, the great radio orator of the 30s, called Ryan disdainfully the Right Reverend New Dealer.
Yes, well, Ryan spoke for the bishops to some extent. The National Catholic Welfare Conference was a voluntary organization, unlike the present National Conference of Catholic Bishops, which is a canonically established organization to which all bishops must belong. The old National Catholic Welfare Conference was a purely voluntary organization, and some bishops didn't like it, didn't agree with it at all, didn't agree with Ryan at all. His worst fight, I suppose, was with Cardinal O'Connell of Boston over the issue of the child labor amendment. Ryan was a strong proponent of the child labor amendment. O'Connell and some of the other bishops were very much opposed to it on the grounds that this would interfere with the freedom of the family, etc. Sounds like ancient history today. But O'Connell took it very seriously, and it's my impression, although I'd have to go back and check the record, that Ryan was not permitted to speak in Boston for some time after that fight. Others would have disagreed with him on, not so much on the pastoral letter of 1919, but on some of his other activities. For example, he supported the packing of the court under Roosevelt. Well, obviously, not all the bishops agreed with that.
In the 1930s, especially during the New Deal, with the election of FDR, there was a gradual union between Catholic social thought and some of the New Deal legislation. There was not direct influence, but what FDR started carrying out and what John Ryan in particular was proposing seemed to coincide.
We didn't have a federal law guaranteeing the right to organize until 1935 with the National Labor Relations Act. Before that, it was every man for himself. They had to go on strike if necessary to get the right to organize. But his interest was in guaranteeing these basic rights under law. So when the National Labor Relations Act was passed in 1935, some 16 years after the Bishop's statement, he hailed it as one of the most important pieces of legislation ever adopted by the federal government.
One of the things that made him distinct in those years was that in the 30s and earlier, but especially in the 30s, many priests and Catholics gave strong support to trade unions as the way to achieve social justice and to improve the lot of Catholic workers. Ryan always supported trade unionism in principle, but he came to believe that the state, that the government, was the indispensable instrument to the attainment of social justice, that without the strength of the government, that American corporate power was such that it would always override efforts to create a more just or more equitable social order, so that Roosevelt's effort to create a state that would take responsibility for some minimum levels of welfare and would use its regulatory authority to discipline business was to him absolutely necessary if justice was to be achieved. And in his later years, after the war started, he died in 1945, he became even more convinced of that. And he was very fearful that after the war, kind of corporate power would return and dominate the country, and that labor unions, good as they were, would never be strong enough to stand up to that power without the support of a democratic state responsive to the real interests and will of the majority of the people. But Ryan was the great theorist of Catholic social teaching in the United States, the man who translated the papal encyclicals, and he stands in a tradition, he's followed by George Higgins and today by Father Brian Hare, that tradition that has oriented the bishops towards strong support for basic social welfare and social justice legislation.